I'm David Brown. We've got a 200-acre property in Sunbury, Gisborne. We've been here about 10 years. We got completely burnt out 8 years ago. So we've got an off-farm business with both vets. My wife Lisa and our 3 kids spend time here. We like the outdoors, we like nature. I like farming, the others don't much. So I grew up on a dairy farm in Gippsland. Went to uni in Melbourne and lived in Melbourne for a little while, but soon discovered A, I didn't want to milk cows for my whole life, and B, I didn't want to live in the city. So this is not the first property we've had, but we've looked around a bit and we just like this one because it's got a valley and it's got a bit of a creek. It's got some low flat areas, it's got some rises, it's got some stone. So when we bought this property, I think there was 2 native trees, 3 paddocks, 2 dams and a fair few weeds. So we started by planting trees first of all and doing a bit of internal fencing to make a few more paddocks. So the fire was 9th of February 2014. We didn't have a lot of infrastructure here. We had some cattle yards which were metal, so they didn't burn. And a new shed, that didn't burn, but all the trees we'd planted, all the fences, some of the stock burnt. So we decided pretty early that we didn't want to go through that again. So we set up the place so that it shouldn't burn. And some of that meant that it wasn't just dry phalaris all summer. There was some other stuff there that might be a bit green that wasn't as flammable. We thought about planting some more trees and trying to get some native grasses to come back and trying to improve the biodiversity of the place so that not everything was exposed to that risk at the one point. You know, after the fire, we thought we could just rebuild everything straight away and just go, you know, just fight back and but you can't. About the time of the fire, I think, I can't recall exactly, I read Peter Andrews' books, Back from the Brink and Beyond the Brink, I think they are, about the Australian landscape and how it evolved to retain water under the soil in the landscape. And his basic principles were to slow the flow of the water through plants and leaky weirs and to allow water to infiltrate under the ground and into the ground and recharge the soil, I guess, with water. Really, what's done the most to improve the water quality and slowing down the water that flowed down our creek was just the reeds that grew in the bottom of the creek. We haven't planted one of them, they're just there. Cows and sheep get a bad rap from people trying to regenerate things, but they're a tool. Some of our grasslands that we have just locked up away from cattle since the fire, some of those need to be grazed now. They're actually degrading a little bit, and having them grazed would improve both the biodiversity and also the health of some of the grasses in there. So you can do that with fire and you can do that with other methods, but the beauty of cows and sheep is they leave manure and urine, which is fertility, and they actually trample some of the grass onto the soil, which then acts as a mulch. So we rotationally graze, and what we try and do is have the cattle in a smaller paddock for a short amount of time, and then we don't have to come back to that paddock for a long time. If you can let that area grow back, and you tend to get a higher succession of grasses in that situation, which are generally more palatable and more productive for stock anyway. You get less weeds because you're not creating bare patches and you're not creating overgrazing, which set stocking and long-term stocking can do. And you're spreading the fertility from the dung and the urine with them in the paddock for a short amount of time. You know, Australia evolved without cattle and sheep, but in Africa and in North America, where there were hard-footed herbivores and there were big herds, what we try and do mimics what the big herds do in the African grasslands, really. and they basically chase the grass and they move on when it's gone, and they don't come back till 12 months later when the grass comes back. All the more palatable native grasses respond to that, and the beauty of those is they don't really require fertiliser other than what the cattle and sheep give them. So things like weeping grasses and kangaroo grass are all very good, and versus your stipers and your more woody speargrass type ones. And then they're not very palatable. They're not great for sheep because the horns get in the wool and the skin. And most of our improved grasses, of which there's plenty here, prefer that rotation of being grazed relatively hard and then allowed to regrow. It's romantic just to have an Indigenous landscape, but we're not really Indigenous. Cattle definitely aren't, sheep aren't, horses aren't. So unless we're going to get rid of all those introduced animals, we're going to have introduced plants. And I think there's a role for all of those things, you know. I see plants as plants. Some people see stuff growing in my paddocks that they call weeds, and maybe they are weeds, but they're still growing. They're still taking carbon dioxide out of the air and sunlight out of the air and turning it into sugars and putting carbon into the soil. They all have a role. A scar on the landscape where there's no plants, and this is nature trying to heal this area. Primary succession mosses to cover the soil, reduce erosion and reduce water loss. Then we'll get some secondary plants like these wallaby grasses or the lomandras, which will come in, and then probably go then to these spear grasses, which are on the periphery, which will then invade in as the primaries and the secondaries do their job. And if this was in a paddock where cows were, it wouldn't happen because of the action of the hooves and their mouths and everything, and they'd eat these wallaby grasses. Well, we still have weeds, but we have less weeds than we did have. We spray some of the ones that are more reproductive, I guess, and are more likely to spread and invade, like serrated tussock and some artichoke thistles and blackberries. But apart from that, we tend to just chip away and just try and improve the whole landscape, and then the weeds don't become a problem. When I grew up and through uni, you know, if you had 200 acres, you needed to get production from 200 acres. I don't think it needs to be like that. You've always got areas that are more productive than others, and the less productive ones for grazing, we think you should turn into something else and let nature take over and, you know, make a grassland or a woodland. It's just a more enjoyable place to be. You know, there's biodiversity around you. There's differences in the farm that you can see different things at different times, and it's not just the same monoculture canvas. There's differences everywhere. We've created a wetland, which is very helpful as well, and that's really just a magnet for biodiversity of birds, frogs, fish, insects. Some of the best successes we've had here is just, you know, an area that we didn't think was particularly productive for cattle for whatever reason, and we've just fenced it off and just let nature take over.